Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am ManyNinjas. Welcome to the next installment of Retro Ninja Gaming, where, rather than going on a lengthy intro, I'm going to suggest you might want a little popcorn for this one, ladies and gentlemen, because we're going to go after the Cossack stages, and I mean all of the Cossack stages in this particular run. Let's get started. How kind of the Doctor to provide a nice train stop outside his fortress. Starting off the stage, we're going to get first the metal hat, which actually manages to negate damage occasionally if any kind of attacks hit you upside the head. Occasionally, because the thing is apparently by its own description kinda cracked, so it doesn't work all the time. In terms of all the special items that we're going to get on this particular run, there are two more items that I'll be looking for, with the last one being on the later part of the stage, which can only really be obtained if you made sure to go through the extra boss fights that were hidden earlier in the game. The first one acts as a trampoline, which basically is a more expensive version of what Beat does when you manage to find him, and the next one will be kind of a shock guard that will prevent you from dying in one hit if you happen to land on some spikes accidentally. Speaking of curious things though, it's really odd to find plane-based enemies in a stage that is primarily made of ice. This first stage is actually pretty short, and we are immediately put to a branching path where if you go down this ladder, you find Beat again. How he managed to get captured a second time? No idea. However, he'll be serving the same kind of function as he did when we found him in the first time, in Skullman stage. Introducing to this game, snow physics. The reason Mega Man has to jump around so much at this point is because if you try to walk straight, you're going to get pretty much nowhere because of the snow hampering all sorts of walking movement. Moving onward, we reached where the game would give you a version of the balloon adapter if you didn't already pick it up. However, using the recycle inhaler will give you the first of the two hidden items I was talking about. In the next section, we have a nice kind of scrolling shoot 'em up, where you're going to be having to rely on having the balloon adapter on at all times. You can, in theory, switch around into another weapon, but the balloon itself will disappear and you'll be plummeting to the ground. One of the key problems on this particular scrolling stage, though, is due to the nature of the balloon adapter, Mega Man can't naturally turn back or turn to the left or right. If you want to get him to look the other way, you have to actually physically jump and land and then pointing in the other direction in order to be able to fire in the other direction. In this case, will be behind me. Of course, the other problem is you can get knocked off the balloon. While Beat is around and will be able to save you if you remember to rescue him earlier, it does cost quite a bit of help. And of course, it might be a bit problematic getting back up for even more health loss later on. Mega Man's inability to turn will become more of a problem later on as the section goes, as you can see for yourself. The dragons on the later part of the section will start homing in on you after a while, and if you happen to knock off quite a bit of the parts, they can move really fast, making it really hard to kind of jump around. Thankfully, the flying whales here, honestly, the Source act as sort of a mini-boss resort, but they're so incredibly easy, it's just a good way to refill on some health. Oh, and a random cutscene as we have the last battle with Shadow Man, at least on this version of the game. Fortunately, Shadow Man is a bit of a pushover, and now that the Shadow Man fight has been defeated, we now have Rush in order to ride around, which means you're free to use any of the master weapons you see fit now. Just to step back on the comment about Shadow Man, there actually was a later edit on this particular thing, kind of an unofficial update, which adds one more bonus fight against Shadow Man that has some really strict requirements though. I believe you have to get to a later part of the Wily stages without having taken a hit the whole game. Suffice to say, that wouldn't be happening on this particular run. As you can probably guess, this whole kind of auto-scrolling shump section is pretty reminiscent of what you got out of Mega Man 8, where of course at that time you could get special items in order to summon Beat, Eddie, Otto, as well as upgrade Rush so he could have a more efficient attack himself. Once you see this blue dragon here, you know you're pretty much home free and just before the boss gate itself. Fortunately with the drill torpedo, he's able to be disposed of very easily, as we see one of the tallest gates that I've ever seen in a Mega Man game. And his conspicuous generosity with a few item drops as well as a free E-tank, which, by the way, in case you do die on this boss fight, do respawn last I check. And we have the first boss of the Cossack stages. Fortunately, due to no real invulnerability between shots, you can pretty much just tank through them as long as you have enough health there. Thank you, mate. And as you can probably see, the drill torpedo makes pretty short work of it. Down goes the first Cossack boss, and we have another little cutscene going on here that will transition into the next stage. Having bridged the perimeter wall, we now find ourselves, quite literally, falling into Cossack Fortress proper now. This being a fortress stage, of course, weapons won't automatically refill between stages, so you have to kind of be a little more careful on how you spend your energy. Otherwise, you'll find yourself having none to work with on the very next stage. This part of the complex looks like it's lined with boss gates, but honestly, most of them are actually just decor for the most part, although it would be really interesting to find or someone to set up a fortress that had that many branching paths is what seemed to be suggested with the nice design here. Another interesting part of this particular stage is that there are certain really large rooms that, if you were to play normally, Pierre Sabe will want you to kind of navigate the whole thing to get to the top of the stage, but since we happen to have the wire adapter from earlier on, we're just going to use that as a bit of a shortcut. And once I start getting aimed in the right direction, that is. Realistically, this stage wants you to go all the way to the right of the stage and slowly climb yourself all the way up. Of course, going by the Yoku blocks, by the way, over the way, but honestly, if you happen to get the adapter from earlier on, you can shave off a lot of time. Speaking of time-saving measures, you'll probably notice if you were to look up other videos of this game that are trying to do speed runs, they'll be using and abusing the hell cycle pretty much as much as possible in order to just really dash across the stage in a very timely fashion. Of course, the small side effect of that being that unless the enemy you hit dies in one hit, you're also going to be taking damage at the same time. To be entirely frank, the only real difficult part of Cossack Fortress 2 would be the room layouts themselves, because either they'll be on a very large side, so you kind of have to scale your way to the eventual exit of a room, or there'll be certain rooms that require you to use things like the balloon or wire adapter to get through, just because otherwise you literally wouldn't be able to make the kind of jumps necessary in order to get yourself out of a situation. In case you're wondering what that 9th gap was, the last item that could be picked up in this game by using the recycle inhaler would be an advanced version of the energy balancer. There's only one small catch though. In order to get that last item, you have to use the recycle inhaler on Eddie himself. Pretty much this kills off Eddie for the rest of the game, and in kind of a disturbing thing, if you were to read the actual description for the item, it would describe that you hear something inside of it, meaning technically Eddie is still at least somewhat aware of what happened to him and is still somewhat around as you have the item. Of course, this also makes it impossible to get a full friend score at the end of the title, because you've killed one of them off, obviously. Suffice to say, we're not going for an all-item run this time around. Speaking of item use, the next two rooms really want you to make good use of the wire adapter in order to get your way up and around. And in this case, I'll oblige it by using the wire adapter. But in this next room, I actually prefer to use a balloon adapter just because it's a bit easier. Of course, this would also be, just to know in this room, I'm going to have a strange death occur because, as you can see, the emulator just went entirely black there for a moment, and I don't know how I fell into the gap or the bottomless pit at the bottom of the screen, because quite frankly, I wasn't moving at the time. Of course, that puts us right back at this point, which is acting as the middle point of the stage. And so we have to scale our way back up using the wire adapter to the top of the room and then get back to the nice little wire adapter only navigation rooms. Just as a brief reminder of how the wire adapter works, it's pretty much in this game unlimited usage, so you can kind of climb your way as much as you want. And if you happen to peg an enemy with the end of the wire adapter, some of them will actually be able to be destroyed by it. Unfortunately, if you're using the wire adapter and are propelling yourself on it, there's nothing that's really protecting Mega Man at any point, so you will still be able to take some damage if you get hit while it's being used. In terms of the balloon adapter, however, it does use up power in order to use it. Namely, it has a very large startup fee of weapon energy, but however, in terms of actual usage as you're moving around, it's a pretty low cost item. Speaking of balloon adapter, it's honestly just a really good way to get through this room in a hurry. And 1 second, there's a jump bike waiting right there, and it's go. Moving onward, we're going to be hitting the last big room before the boss gate itself, which is mostly filled with metals. If you didn't already have the metal hat at this point, this would be a really good place to pick it up because you're going to be running into a metal basically every step of the way. In case you're wondering why I use the weapon the master weapons so often, it's really because of a few reasons. The first being that although the regular shot of the Mega Buster is pretty much what you expect standard fare, the charge shot, for its nice and fancy effects based off the X series, is actually a pretty pitiful weapon, and you really don't want to use your charge shot too much of the time. The second, this game is honestly, at least I feel, really generous with giving you weapon pellets, both small and large, so you're able to refill your weapon pretty quickly. Also, you can refill your weapons if you have already full health at any point. Any life items you'll get, or health items, will automatically convert into weapon energy because of the items you have there. Third, if you happen to die for any reason, the game will automatically refill some of your weapon energy when you respawn. So realistically, there's not a whole hell of a lot of reasons not to use the weapons. Enough weapon talk for now. We're now going to be hitting the next of the Cossack bosses, which is based heavily on Surge's Devil Machine from the Mega Man X2 title. Of course, that means the same way that it's taken care of here is how it's done. You find the weak point, which in this case is by the shining orb, and pretty much just do whatever you need to do in order to take some shots at it. As you go along, if you either take too long in order to get rid of it, or manage to destroy one of these orbs, the whole kind of case there will scroll on the next part of the screen and bring you to the next section. Now, one of the better ways to get around this is to use something that has a piercing ability, like a drill torpedo or the water cutter. Otherwise, you realistically have to shoot down everything that is guarding the orbs in order to take some proper shots at it. The only problem, though, is because the orb can move around, especially more so as this boss's health gets lower, you might find yourself wasting a bit too much energy firing at something that isn't there anymore. Part of the reason why they want you hopping between all the platforms all the time. This constant shifting position will only get more erratic as it goes on. And also, as you can probably notice for yourself, I don't know if it's just because something on the platform hit me first, but thankfully if you do get hit and get knocked off a platform, you have at least a little bit of a breathing time in order to get back onto one of the floating platforms before the spikes on the bottom of the stage kill you. This broad laser shot pattern is one of the last ones you'll see before it goes into its final desperation mode, which will be demonstrated fairly shortly once I manage to take this last bit down. As you can see, it's really changing position a lot, which made it so I wasted the last of my drill torpedo, and now I think I actually wasted a lot of the water cutter here just because the damn thing moves so much. In hindsight, and what I'll be doing in a second, for the last section, once you really have it close to dying and it's just shifting around a lot, what you really want to do is equip the barrel shotgun, which can be shot and will be firing 5 different shots aiming at various angles. That way you have a much better chance of hitting it whenever you fire. And of course, if you're charging the shots, it'll take off its health only that much faster. Now it's on its last leg, you want to get away from that panel in front, and it'll start one last shifting pattern, shooting a shot that will break into a pattern of 4 smaller shots, alternating which direction the arrows go. And that's the last of the second Cossack boss. Moving onward, we're going to have, if you could please, the next stage transition, as we do more falling. Unfortunately, the stage I'm falling into is Cossack stage number 3, otherwise known as obligatory water and spike physics. I'd rather be facing the Ghost of Christmas Past again. At least with Ghost of Christmas Past, any deaths were mostly because I was just playing somewhat poorly, or pretty much couldn't just reach the ghosts in order to just shoot them properly. Here is due to messed around jump physics due to the water, and hitting spikes. Or anything else really, again and again and again. Seriously folks, if you manage to get past these first few rooms in this particular Cossack stage, you're basically home free. Mostly though if you hang around the top path, as the bottom path, which I'm going to be demonstrating after dispatching this now evolved version of Jumpig in the next minute, introduces a new kind of water physics, which are kind of described as kind of oil physics of sorts. The way this thing works, as long as you're below the top of the water line, you can actually navigate yourself using your directional buttons. Of course, the moment you rise above for a little too long, you start sinking like a stone for no good reason. Which is exactly what happens here. And of course, now this next step is brought to you by me just not equipping the right weapon and taking some stupid hits along the way. And now that we're done with our obligatory death sequence for this entire video, let's move on with a more successful run. First, a careful jump to get across, recycling handler to get that. We're going to use a balloon in order to just get by here, so we can get by with more than one health on this particular exchange. That up and down enemy, for the most part, I don't think can be dispatched by anything but the recycle inhaler. And we'll pretty much just be using some math weapons just to clear out the fishies and move along in a more peaceful fashion. But for the most part, hindsight being 20/20, going around the upper part of this particular section, and for most of the stage for that matter, tends to be the safer side. You don't get as many items along the way, you won't be seeing any E-tanks as far as I know, but quite frankly you'll be having less problems too. Also learned at this moment, the water cutter really doesn't do much on those shells there. So really you're just better off using something like the drill torpedo to get your way by. Alright, branching path. This time we're taking the high road. As I forgot, Jumpig was already dead and wasted that rush cannon for nothing. The only type of water physics you have to worry about on this particular upper path is the running current. Of course, there'll be a few pipes you can break along the way, but as long as you don't shoot the pipes and burst them, you're usually good for the most part. Most of the pipes are actually pretty avoidable. I'm going to use the balloon adapter just because this one jump is a bit long, and of course with the current physics, it's really easy to accidentally trash it. Oh wait, now that I think about it, I'm slightly mistaken about the E-tank. There is one E-tank, which you can use the controllable ring in order to avoid what could be a deadly slide. We're going to take the opportunity to get another one up in order to refill some of the ones that have been lost in the earlier parts of this particular round. And then proceed basically just to hang to the right and keep going along the stage as per plan. Until you get to maybe the last part of the stage, the rest of it is actually pretty straightforward on the upper path. Just a matter of just some careful jumps here, getting rid of the crowd so they can't accidentally trap you in a bubble in order to have you careening off stage. One last mini-boss, which can be dispatched in one rush cannon shot, and you're actually basically clear. This will be the room where everything converges back into place. Just careful collection of that weapon energy. And here's a small bit of a jumping puzzle. What the game wants you to do is to use the floating bubbles big and small in order to navigate yourself all the way to the left of the stage in order to get at a switch item, but demonstrating just how much health the balloon has even at nothing. It can take you the whole trip around, at least one way, even if you only have the one shot left. Now that we hit the switch, we can just use the current in order to propel Mega Man without any use of any items to the last part there. Conspicuous items mean there's a boss coming up very shortly. In this case, just one last obstacle before the boss. These giant bubbles, once you start bursting them, start breaking down into smaller bubbles, and then break it down into 4 really small ones. Realistically, you want to use an item to just kind of comb through them, kind of just pierce them as quickly as possible, but since I kind of figure I'm a little low on weapon energy for some of those items, I kind of want to avoid them, if possible. At least until the next round, which will introduce 2 bubbles, and there'll actually be a 3rd round that'll introduce 1 more bubble to go along. If you want to be able to pierce them in a fast fashion, which I'm going to be using on the next round, the Toad Spell is actually pretty good for nullifying any bubbles that are directly around your perimeter. The only downside though is that Toad Spell uses so much weapon energy that you're going to use it up before you can clear up all 3 rounds, so it'll only get you so far really. Your best bet is to, what I discovered later on, just jump in the general area and keep really close in order to make the most out of Toad Spell as you can. Thankfully, even if you manage to collide against the larger bubbles, they really don't do that much damage. So this room is really just more of a time waster than anything. Speaking of piercing items, just remembered I had enough of the drill torpedo in order to get through. It'll manage to go through various rows of the bubbles. Pretty much anything that's straight above it will be taken out. And that's a good way to not only pierce the medium-sized one, but a bunch of the small ones along the way. The last item that could really be useful here would probably be something like the ferro shotgun, just to dispatch. If you had the bubbles kind of in a closer cluster, it could get rid of a bunch of them in one shot. Or if you just needed the angles, something like maybe the water cutter or the adjustable ring. Hey, nice cameo from CWP01 from the first Mega Man game. Getting back to the point, last one to bring that ring, but honestly, you want to save the ring for the boss for this one, which I don't know what the proper name of it is, but it's another devil type. Now the trick behind this devil is it's going to be on a scrolling stage here. The blocks that it ends up throwing all over the stage will act as your platforms for the fight. If you happen to reach any point where it knocks you to a section where there are no visible platforms at the bottom, that will act as a bottomless pit and pretty much kill you. Once you get it to low enough health, it'll start changing its pattern up around midpoint, and at the end it'll just turn into kind of just the eyeball with a circling protection of a sort of blocks that it'll occasionally toss out. The middle pattern, as you can see, starts tossing Tetris patterns at you. Here's what the last pattern looks like. It doesn't open his eye as often, but once it does, be sure to pelt it with some rings in order to take down its health in a hurry. Thankfully, when its eyes open, it doesn't have much in terms of invulnerability frame, so you can usually take it out pretty fast. That takes care of Wily. Oh, but not Wily. That's too early for Wily yet. That takes care of Cossack boss number 3, as we begin the next cutscene, which will bring us into the 4th and finally Cossack stage. Did I just say finally? I meant to say final. I really want to say Wily for some reason. Anywho, as the map design shows you, this stage is kind of broken up into 4 parts, all along the 4 towers of the stage. We have the first mini-boss, which are pretty much, I think it's octopods or something like that. I can't remember what this particular enemy is, but this particular variant comes as a modified version of what you find in the Game Boy games, and goes down to the water cutter easily enough. Anytime any of those things hit the floor and ceiling though, it'll do a bit of a shakedown, so you might want just to jump in order to keep your footing as best as you can. Once you get rid of the first one though, you meet what is the first of 4 generators that you need to shatter in order to get through a nice defensive grid or defensive shield that is set up around where Cossack is hiding himself. You see Rush there, but if you attempt to use Rush in order to get to that tower before the shields are actually down, you'll just kind of crash against it. I don't think you actually take any damage, you do crash, but it just kind of wastes your time, really. Between each generator is a small platforming bit where really you have a few careful jumps in order to make, and you have to go through a small series of enemies, which will actually vary depending on which section you're running or jumping through. And all of the other towers will actually be guarded by Game Boy exclusive enemies that have been ported to this particular Romhack. In a rather clever bit of engineering, Gearsabe has also set it up that for these last few Game Boy exclusive bosses before Cossack himself, if you beat them you can actually take a hold of their master weapon and use it to replace your regular buster for at least the course of this stage. The first of these mini-bosses that I come across is Terra. He acts a lot like his general Game Boy self, although he gains, or at least he makes use of a teleport later on to possibly move to the other side of the stage. Honestly, with the way the AI is set up, he's fairly content on just standing in that one spot, maybe hopping back and forth once or twice, and trying to use either his homing weapon against you, or that one causing weapon, which is fairly easy to dodge as long as you're far enough back. The only word of caution is, if you happen to kill him while his homing shot is still on screen, the shot will at least remain for a few seconds longer and try to come after you still, and can honestly kill you if you're not careful. Since I've grabbed the item, we now have his homing shot as the main weapon here, and can use it in order to just cruise along the rest of the stage for the most part. the way Terra's weapon works is effectively as long as you hold the button down and there's an enemy on screen, your shot will automatically go after them, and anything else, kind of like the obstacles going along the way, and you can just worry about just trying to dodge the whole time. Not to entirely spoil, but realistically of the remaining bosses or sub-bosses, however they can be called in this particular section, realistically you either want to keep Terra's weapon or use the, if I'm correct on the sequence I went with, the next boss's master weapon in order to get by. Yep, just as I thought. If you don't use Terra's weapon, you realistically want to keep a hold of Balan and his Balad cracker in order to get by, because you can actually use it to aim in multiple directions and it does quite a bit of damage. Of course, you can't have a stage without a jumping battle, although this time it's entirely optional. You can see even with the enhanced weapon, it still takes a stupid amount of hits in order to get past jumping, so realistically, if you can spare it, use the rush cannon in order to just get by him in a hurry. That makes 3 towers down, which brings us to moving towards the next and last of the tower bosses, who happens to be also a Rockman killer for that matter. As you can probably guess, since we already faced previous Rockman killer in one of the earlier Robot Master stage, that really leaves only the one option left of the last boss being Punk from Mega Man 3 of the Game Boy games. Well, his master weapon, the... one second, I'm trying to remember the name of it right now. Yes, the Screw Crusher, which I believe off the top of my head does the most damage of the weapons you can steal on the stage, but the problem is, due to its arc, it's also the hardest to aim. Moving onward, to Punk himself, his sequence begins fairly easy enough. His own Screw Crushers are actually really slow, especially compared to the Mega Man 10 variant, which is playable in the actual Capcom special stages. His automatic, or his desperation mode has him tossing out more Screw Crushers no matter, and his kind of room traveling pattern becomes a bit more complicated. However, with something like the homing shot, it's fairly easy. As you can see, now everything's gone dark. The tower can now be penetrated, and now we enter the last boss fight. For the Cossack stages, Cossack himself. Since we kept Terra's weapon, realistically all you need to do is just hold it down, and then, as long as you keep avoiding, the homing laser will do the rest of the work itself. Now we have Cossack down to part 2 of this battle. He'll start throwing in a pattern where he just throws out an occasional shot. This also goes by quickly, and we reach the last overall pattern where he's now just kind of bouncing around in his own capsule across the stage. Once you take him down to half health, he'll also shoot up an occasional shot or two, but realistically, if you reach this point, you basically have the match won. Barring being low on health. Just going to use that 1A tank to get by. I forgot I had the last protective shot, and that does it for Cossack. We have a bit more of a story exposition, where we reveal, once again, Wily is behind everything as per usual. A little English, and we'll be moving on to the Wily stages shortly enough. In terms of the general difficulty of the Cossack stages as a whole, with the exception of the 3rd stage due to its water physics and spikes, the Cossack stages are just kind of there, really. They're kind of a warm-up act to the overall Wily Fortress stages, where the difficulty will really crank up in comparison. Also, the Wily stages will introduce something incredibly convoluted, but I'll go into detail about that when we go into that particular stage itself. Even though Pure Sabe doesn't have English as a first language, you kind of have to appreciate just how much more story inclusion there is in this particular game, or this Romhack, than there was in the original Mega Man 4 title. It's just kind of interesting how they draw everything together, and in this case there's some story exposition that might come into play later on in the game, depending on how well you go. Well, now that we have that, we now begin the next little video segment there. We are officially introduced to Dr. Wily and what will be the beginning of the Wily stages. Join me next time for what's bound to be another supersized episode of Retro Ninja Gaming, where if everything works out, we'll have a special guest, at least for the first part.